The envelope was already waiting for me on the table. I hadn't even sat down when Gregory slid it forward, his eyes avoiding mine. Fixated instead on the young woman perched 2 chairs down. Madison, the kind of polished, overconfident smile that comes too easily when the game has already been won. "We've decided to make a few structural changes," Gregory began, tapping his pen against the polished wood. "Effective immediately. Your salary will be adjusted. A 50% reduction." He said it like he was commenting on the weather. "And your position will be transitioned," he added, with a slight glance toward Madison. "We've appointed Madison as acting VP of operations. She's been preparing for this." That line stung harder than the numbers on the paper. "She's been preparing for this." I turned to Madison. She didn't even try to hide it. Her smirk gave her away. She knew, she had known. This wasn't abrupt. It was arranged. I'd been blindsided, but they'd rehearsed it. I blinked once. No gasp, no defense. Just a slow inhale as I stared at the envelope with my name printed cleanly on top. "Understood," I said, and stood up. 10 years at this company. 15. If you count the sleepless nights during the startup years. I had managed every crisis, stabilized every division, earned the trust of our biggest partners. And now I was being replaced by a 25-year-old with a family tree instead of a resume. No performance review, no warning, just a smile and an envelope. Madison reached out her hand like it was some passing of the torch. "I hope you'll stick around to help me transition. I know this must be sudden." Sudden? No, it was surgical. I didn't take her hand. I didn't say goodbye. I walked out without another word. But as the door closed behind me, I knew something they didn't. They had just fired the wrong woman, and I was about to show them exactly how wrong they were. The walk back to my office that day felt like stepping through fog, each hallway familiar, yet suddenly foreign. The glass walls, the sleek chairs, the framed mission statements I'd helped draft, all of it now felt like the backdrop of someone else's company. Madison's, perhaps, or Gregory's, but certainly not mine. I sat down in the chair I'd spent years in and let the silence fall over me like dust. My fingers rested on the desk where I'd once negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts, designed entire operational infrastructures, and turned chaos into rhythm. I'd never chased the spotlight. I'd let others do the press briefings and ribbon cuttings, but behind every headline was a spreadsheet I'd balanced, a crisis I'd managed, a fire I'd extinguished before anyone even smelled the smoke. I met Charles Winstone in the company's second year, before there were offices, before there was even a logo. We worked out of a cramped shared space with one printer and a coffee machine that only brewed resentment. He was sharp, erratic, and impossible to please, but he respected competence. That's how I got in. Not through connections, not through charm, through results. We built everything from scratch. When funding dried up in year 3, I found a way to keep payroll going without laying off a single soul. When a key supplier backed out days before launch, I flew to Indiana and negotiated a new deal overnight. Charles used to joke that I was the only person who scared him more than the investors. And now, here I was, replaced. Not for failure, not for misconduct, just replaced. Quietly, cleanly, politically. I stared at the stack of files on my desk, many of them signed by me, still in use, still forming the backbone of day-to-day operations. Pride swelled in my chest, but so did a bitter twist of grief. This wasn't just a job they'd taken. It was my legacy they were trying to white out. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Jonah, our former head of product who had left 6 months ago after a disagreement with Gregory. "Lisa, I just heard. This is complete bulls. You built this place. I don't agree with what they did. I owe you more than you know." I stared at the message for a long moment, then turned off the screen. That one message did something Gregory's entire boardroom couldn't. It reminded me that my worth wasn't tied to the title they stripped from me. They could hand my position to anyone they liked. But the foundation? The bones of this company? They were still mine. The chair used to creak a little when I leaned back in it. Madison's legs didn't even touch the floor. She sat at the head of the long glass table now, my chair, flipping through a printed agenda she clearly didn't write. Her voice was unnaturally chipper, like she was auditioning for a reality show instead of leading a boardroom meeting. "Oh, okay," she said, clapping once. "Let's streamline our vendor contracts and consolidate logistics in Q4. I think we can cut 30%. Maybe?" I blinked. 30%? She looked around for approval. No one spoke. A few nodded robotically. The same men who used to defer to me for strategy were now playing along. Eyes down, mouths shut. I clenched my pen so tightly I left marks in my palm. She had no idea what she was saying. Our logistics were already running lean. 30% cuts meant missed deliveries, unhappy clients, possible lawsuits. I could see it. They couldn't. Or worse, they did. And didn't care. I opened my mouth, then closed it. The new Lisa didn't speak unless she had to. When it came time to review departmental updates, Madison called on everyone but me. I wasn't on the new executive loop anymore. My job now, apparently, was to sit, smile, and serve as a relic of the old guard. Still, I listened carefully. Something wasn't right. Too many metrics were missing, too many generalizations with no supporting data. The CFO, Daniel, barely spoke. When he did, his numbers felt off. He kept glancing at me like he wanted to say something, then stopped himself. When the meeting ended, the room cleared faster than usual. Madison beamed as she shook hands with the VPs, oblivious to the tension she left hanging in the air like smoke. I stayed seated. Daniel hesitated at the doorway. Then, quietly, he circled back. He didn't speak, just slipped a folded printout under my notebook and walked away. I waited until the hallway was empty before unfolding it. It was a financial risk summary, unfiltered, raw, buried 2 levels beneath the sanitized dashboard she'd shown in the meeting. Profit margins were slipping. 2 major clients had pulled back contracts. Vendor disputes were rising. And there was a quiet memo from legal warning of a possible breach in compliance. None of this had been mentioned, so that's what they were doing. They weren't ignoring the storm. They were covering the windows and lighting candles. I folded the paper back up, slid it into my notebook, and left the boardroom. Anger burned beneath my skin, but I kept my steps even. They thought I was just another ghost of the old regime. Let them think it. They'd feel the aftershock soon enough. The late afternoon light spilled through the blinds in my apartment, washing the room in a dusty gold that made everything feel like memory. I hadn't planned to open the drawer that day, but something about that morning in the boardroom, watching Madison butcher strategy while Gregory nodded like a bobblehead, had stirred something deeper than anger. Grief. The kind that doesn't fade. It just waits. I reached into the bottom drawer of my bookshelf and pulled out the small mahogany box. Smooth. Weighty. Unmarked. Charles had given it to me himself. No context, no instructions, just a soft, hoarse whisper. "You'll know when." That was 9 months ago. 9 months since I watched the strongest man I knew wither in a hospital bed. Lungs drowning in silence. Voice fighting for clarity. I visited every day, not out of obligation, but because I couldn't imagine him dying alone. His family rarely came. Gregory always had an excuse. Too many meetings, too little time. Madison never once showed. Charles would squeeze my hand, even when he couldn't speak. Some days he'd drift in and out, others. He'd insist on sitting up just to talk for 5 minutes about quarterly forecasts or the weather in Shanghai. Still working. Even as his body gave out, one afternoon, just weeks before he passed. He looked at me with eyes clearer than I'd seen in months. "Lisa," he rasped, "they don't know who you are, not really. But one day, they'll learn, when they're too late to stop you." I didn't understand it then. I only cried, squeezing his hand until the nurse came in. The day he died, he made the nurse swear she'd deliver the box to me directly. She kept her word. I kept my promise to wait until it mattered. And now, it mattered. I opened the lid slowly, my heart drumming. Inside were a few neatly folded documents, an embossed leather key fob, and a handwritten letter in his unmistakable scrawl. The letter said only one thing. "The Winstone Foundation holds what the board thinks they own. You are the steward. If they forget who you are, remind them, quietly." I ran my fingers over the letter, vision blurring. I wasn't just his VP. I was his contingency, his safeguard, his legacy. And now, their mistake. The ache in my chest deepened. But it wasn't sorrow anymore. It was clarity. A quiet, cruel clarity wrapped in mahogany and memory. They thought they had buried the last piece of Charles. They didn't realize he'd handed it to me. I should have seen it coming the moment the calendar invite hit my inbox. Team culture reset, all staff mandatory. The subject line was already a warning. Gregory never cared about culture, and Madison didn't even know how to spell it 2 months ago. But I went. I went because that's what professionals do, even when they're no longer wanted. The auditorium was packed, bright fluorescent lights, branded coffee cups on foldable tables, new posters hung on the walls, filled with stock photos of smiling interns and buzzwords like innovation, agility, relevance. I took a seat in the second row, where I used to sit when I ran these meetings, back when my words shaped policy, not small talk. Madison strutted onto the small stage like a contestant about to announce the top 5. She wore a mic and a fitted blazer she clearly borrowed from someone who'd earned it. Her voice rang out, peppy and artificial. "Today is about moving forward," she said, smiling with the energy of a YouTube influencer. "It's about shaking off the old habits and embracing a new culture, one that's younger, sharper, less heavy." A ripple of polite laughter spread. I sat stone still. She kept going, slide after slide with vague bullet points about empowered voices, dynamic leadership, and legacy fatigue. Then came the moment she'd been waiting for. "Let's talk about systems that no longer serve us," she said, clicking to a slide titled, "When Tenure Blocks Growth." She gestured toward me. "Take Lisa, for example," she said sweetly. "She's been with us for a long time, and while her experience is admirable, we must recognize when tradition becomes resistance." The air tightened. Someone coughed. A few eyes flicked toward me. I didn't move. "This isn't about any one person," she added, still smiling. "It's about making space for fresh energy, for the future." Every word was a blade, thin, sharp, deliberate. She was stripping me in front of my own people, turning legacy into liability. And no one stopped her, until a voice broke through the silence. "Excuse me," a young woman said, standing up 2 rows behind me. It was Ava, new hire, fresh out of grad school, still learning the names of the printers. "With respect," she said, "Lisa helped me through onboarding when no one else had time. She fixed 3 of my access issues herself. If that's resistance, I want more of it." The room froze. Madison blinked. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Ava had done what I couldn't. She'd reminded them who I was, when I couldn't even speak it myself. And in that moment, beneath all the shame, something fragile held on, something unbroken. The box sat on my kitchen counter like it had been waiting to breathe. It had followed me from office to office, through 2 apartments and 1,000 unread memories. For 9 months, I kept it closed, not because I forgot, but because I wasn't ready. I'd told myself it was out of respect for Charles. But really, I'd been afraid of what it meant to open it, until now. I lifted the lid with steady hands. Inside, beneath the folded letter I'd already read, was a leather folio with a gold-embossed seal, the Winstone Foundation. I took it out and flipped it open. My name was there, printed, initialed, notarized. Lisa Renee Hall, legal trustee and steward of assets, Winstone Foundation. Attached was a unique alphanumeric code, instructions for accessing the digital portal, and a set of restricted control credentials. My heart skipped once, then steadied. This wasn't theory. This was binding. I sat at the dining table and logged into the portal. Two-factor authentication, biometric check, signature verification, and then access granted. The interface was cold, elegant, efficient. Dozens of portfolio assets, real estate holdings, offshore accounts, partner agreements, IP patents, executive power of attorney. I recognized many of the names, subsidiary firms, licensing contracts, even the commercial property deed to Winstone's headquarters. The foundation didn't just support the company, it quietly owned it. And through Charles's will, I now held full control. I dialed the number at the bottom of the screen, a contact marked Legal Counsel, activation only. The voice on the other end was calm, British, and startlingly prepared. "Ms. Hall," he said, "we've been expecting your call." "I need confirmation," I said. "I want no ambiguity. Do I have control?" There was a pause, a flicker of keyboard clacking. "Yes," he replied. "You are the sole legal trustee of the foundation. That gives you majority influence over any entity the foundation invests in, most notably Winstone Dynamics." My chest rose. "So I can remove executives, reassign assets, pause operations," he continued. "And, if you choose, liquidate divisions, though I advise caution." I nodded slowly. Even though he couldn't see me, he hesitated for a moment, then added, "There's one detail I should highlight. The foundation also holds the original patents and intellectual property on Winstone's proprietary logistics system and client matching algorithm. They were filed under Charles's name and transferred into the trust 4 years ago. You control them now." I leaned back in my chair, mind racing. They had cut my salary, replaced my title, mocked me in front of the company. But they'd been standing on ground I now legally owned, for the first time in weeks. I felt something rise in my chest, not rage, not bitterness, but clarity, and with it, possibility. The hardest part wasn't deciding what to do. It was deciding to do it in silence. After the call with the foundation's legal counsel, I didn't slam doors or send threats. I didn't march back into the boardroom demanding recognition. No. That wasn't my way, and it was never Charles's, instead. I moved quietly, deliberately. The first action, I authorized full activation of trustee powers through the foundation's portal. The digital paperwork was dense, layered with legal provisions, but I knew exactly what I was signing. I didn't hesitate. Each click was a controlled detonation, triggered not with rage, but precision. Within 48 hours, control of several key contracts, intellectual properties, and real estate holdings shifted names, not to me personally, but back into the foundation's name, under my stewardship. This included the lease agreement for Winston's headquarters, the licensing of their flagship algorithm, and, most notably, client data ownership clauses that had once been casually overlooked in buried partnership agreements. One by one, the pillars began moving. Still, I said nothing. Inside the company, things continued as usual, or so they thought. Madison was busy filming an internal video series about fresh voices and transformational leadership. Gregory had reportedly flown to Geneva for investor meetings. No one noticed that their legal footing was cracking beneath them. Until Thursday. That morning, I received an alert from the foundation dashboard. Client D, North America, had paused their payment schedule. This wasn't a small account. It was a $12.4 million logistics partnership, Winstone's second-largest revenue stream for Q3. The reason, written in formal email headers and firm tone, was simple. As per our long-standing agreement with Lisa Hall, we are suspending all pending transactions until we receive direct written confirmation from her. I reread the line 3 times. They had assumed I was out of the picture. They were wrong. By noon, the finance department at Winston was scrambling. I watched the panic unfold in the background from my private terminal, a mirror image of the systems I once built. Requests were flying back and forth. Internal Slack channels lit up. No one knew why a top-tier client had gone dark. But I did. And I still said nothing. That was the difference between noise and control. Madison gave speeches. Gregory gave orders. But I signed the ground they stood on. And now, one signature at a time. I was pulling it back, not out of revenge, not yet, out of responsibility for the company I helped build, and the future I was about to reclaim. It began with an error message, just before 9 a.m. on a Monday. A project manager on the 5th floor tried logging into the customer analytics dashboard. Access denied. Then the CRM failed to load. Then came the Slack outage, the frozen admin panel, the finance team unable to approve payroll. Within 20 minutes, the entire operational spine of Winstone Dynamics went stiff. There were no alarms, no viruses, no angry hackers or screaming alerts. Just silence. Like someone had turned off gravity and no one had noticed until the furniture floated. I sat at home in my small apartment, sipping coffee, laptop closed. I didn't need to check the system logs. I knew what was happening. This was not a breach. This was ownership reclaiming itself. The foundation, now fully active under my legal authority, had retracted every digital and legal asset it controlled: systems, licenses, algorithms, client access permissions, and all embedded APIs. The intellectual property powering the company's engine had been leased, never sold, and the lease had quietly expired. No one had renewed it, because no one thought I mattered anymore. I imagined Gregory somewhere in a boardroom, barking at IT to just fix it, completely unaware that the man he was shouting at no longer had system access. Madison, likely refreshing her screen in panic, wondering why the upload she promised during a live webinar refused to launch. Downstairs, the legal department would be tearing through files, trying to understand how contracts suddenly had caveats they'd never noticed. They had never asked who owned the data pipeline, because back then, Charles trusted me to write the clause. And now, that clause had become their coffin. By 10:15 a.m., my inbox was full, some desperate, some passive-aggressive, all from people who had never once thanked me but were now begging for clarity. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. At 11:27 a.m., the final blow landed. Each member of the board received the same fax, yes, fax, sent directly from the Winstone Foundation's legal desk, stamped with the original seal and notarized signature, effective immediately. All assets currently held or co-managed by the Winstone Foundation are under the legal stewardship of Lisa Renee Hall. Any executive decisions, client renewals, or access permissions require her explicit authorization. I didn't announce it. I didn't post a press release or call a meeting. I simply let the facts speak. By noon, the company had no functioning product, no live dashboard, no customer access, and no idea how to get it back. And I went for a walk. No power trip, no gloating, just quiet air, cool against my skin. It felt like balance returning, for weeks. I'd sat in rooms where my voice was ignored, where my name was used only in past tense. Now, I didn't have to raise it at all. Gregory was unraveling. Madison was vanishing behind a wall of unread emails. People who once clapped when I was demoted were now asking who could save them. They wouldn't hear from me today, because this wasn't revenge. It was gravity being restored. And I was the one who flipped the switch. They scheduled the emergency board meeting for 8 o'clock a.m., calling it a critical realignment session. No agenda was circulated, no names were mentioned, but I knew exactly what they were hoping for. Damage control. The conference room was packed by 7:50 a.m., with executives nervously checking their phones, whispering in corners, trying to guess who would take the fall for the chaos. Gregory sat at the head of the table, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened to give the illusion of urgency. His usual smug composure had cracked. Madison was to his right, face pale, hands clenched, visibly rattled. She looked nothing like the woman who had once smiled while publicly dressing me down. The door opened at 8 o'clock a.m., and I walked in without a word. Conversations halted. I didn't wear a power suit or carry a speech, just a plain black folder and the same calm expression I'd worn the day they tried to erase me. That expression. I noticed. Now unsettled them more than rage ever could. Gregory stood halfway, as if unsure whether to greet me or guard himself. "Lisa," he started. "I don't think—" I placed the folder on the table and flipped it open, revealing a single page with 3 lines of text and 2 official seals. "I'm not here to debate," I said, evenly. "I'm here to confirm what you already received in writing." I turned to the board members, their faces tightening with recognition. "As legal trustee of the Winstone Foundation," I continued, "I now represent controlling interest in over 60% of this company's assets, including the intellectual property, headquarters lease, and strategic client data, which means, effective now, this board answers to me." The silence was so dense it hummed. Gregory opened his mouth, but the chairman of the board beat him to it. "We received confirmation last night," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Everything checks out." I looked at Gregory. "You can resign now, or be formally removed. Your choice." He stiffened, lips pressed into a thin line, after a long beat. He nodded. "I'll resign." I turned to Madison, who had shrunk into her chair. "As for you," I said, voice cool, "your title is being dissolved. You'll be reassigned to a support role in regional operations." Her face went blank, shock giving way to silent fury. "I suggest you start reading the manuals." I watched the words land, but I didn't linger. I had one final move. "I will not be resuming the role of vice president," I announced to the room. "Instead, I've appointed Ava Clark, operations manager in logistics, as acting VP, effective today." Gasps. Madison's face twisted. "Ava? The new hire who stood up for me in the town hall weeks ago?" "She's competent," I added. "She listens, and she remembers who built this place." The board scribbled. Cameras clicked. The press would hear by 12:15 p.m., but none of it mattered as much as the look on their faces, faces that once looked past me. Now they were forced to look at me. I didn't sit at the head of the table, because I didn't need a chair to wear the crown. I'd reclaimed more than a title. I'd reclaimed the center of gravity. By the time the dust settled, I wasn't on magazine covers. I wasn't tagged in headlines or mentioned in press releases. And that was exactly how I wanted it. In the weeks after the boardroom shift, most assumed I had disappeared. Rumors swirled. Some said I had sold my shares and retired. Others claimed I'd taken a consulting role overseas. No one guessed the truth. I hadn't left. I had simply changed seats. Through the Winstone Foundation. I now controlled the rhythm of the company without ever stepping back into its spotlight. I didn't need the corner office or the nameplate on the glass door. My authority no longer came from a title. It came from stewardship. The foundation became the pulse behind every decision, not for ego, not for power, but to rebuild something sustainable, Something that wouldn't collapse under the weight of ego-driven leadership again. Ava took over as VP. She was young, sharp, and humble enough to ask questions instead of pretending to have answers. She didn't need to impress anyone. She just listened. And in return, people began to speak again. Departments that had felt hollow came back to life. The walls no longer echoed with fear or favoritism, but with conversation and problem-solving. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't fast. But it was working. One afternoon, alone in my living room, I opened the final envelope from Charles. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Slanted. Stubborn. Alive. You don't need a title to shape destiny. You've never needed one. You've held the crown in silence longer than most wear it in arrogance. I sat with those words for a long time. He had seen it in me before I ever saw it in myself. And now, after everything they took, I had built something stronger, not in my name, but in the name of every silent builder who came before me and every unheard voice that would come after. It wasn't about revenge. It never really was. It was about reclaiming the dignity of the work, quietly, fully, permanently. If this story moved you, don't let it end here, like the video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And drop a comment below. Tell me, have you ever been overlooked for something you built with your own hands? And if stories like this speak to your soul, subscribe to the channel. Because the quiet crowns, they're everywhere, and they deserve to be seen. The boardroom clock ticked louder than it should have, each second stretching like a warning I couldn't quite hear yet. Sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the mahogany table in harsh gold. My palms rested on a folder of performance reports, proof of 14 years of wins. Late nights, and deals closed when everyone else had given up. I expected recognition. What I got was something else entirely. Across from me sat Declan Moore, my brother-in-law turned CEO, shoulders squared in the leather chair he treated like a throne. He didn't bother with small talk. His style was clean cuts, sharp words, and just enough venom to make sure you remembered who was in charge. Soraya, we're cutting your salary in half, effective immediately. I blinked once, steadying myself against the tidal wave rising in my chest. 14 years, gone with a single sentence. Let me stop for a moment and remind you. Remember to get regular checkups. Your body deserves that small act of care, especially when life throws punches. And tell me where you're watching this from. Hit the like and subscribe buttons if you've ever felt invisible in your own family. I am Soraya Ross, the woman who built distribution systems that saved millions, who turned panicked clients into loyal contracts, who skipped birthdays and anniversaries so this company wouldn't miss a delivery window. I wasn't a name on a family tree. I was the backbone they leaned on when everything else cracked. Yet here I was, dismissed as disposable. Declan leaned back, lips curling into that smirk I'd seen too many times at family dinners. Think of it as a lesson, he added, voice smooth and cruel. A reminder for those who aren't true blood. The air thickened. Every polished oak panel seemed to press against me. The scent of burnt coffee turned bitter, as though the room itself recoiled from his arrogance. I kept my expression neutral, a mask I'd perfected after years of being the outsider in both family and business. Inside, though, humiliation twisted into something hotter. I understand, I answered evenly, meeting his stare without flinching. My words sounded calm, but my heartbeat thundered like war drums. He thought he'd clipped my wings. What he didn't realize was that fire can burn quietly until the moment it consumes everything in its path. Family dinners at the Moore estate were never really about food. They were stages, long polished tables, glasses of wine that sparkled under chandeliers, and conversations that always circled back to business. That night, I sat across from Declan, who looked more like a victorious general than a man telling a story over steak. His voice carried through the dining room as he recounted the tough but necessary decision he had made earlier that day. Sometimes leadership means making unpopular calls, Declan said, carving into his filet mignon with smug precision. Cutting Soraya's salary was one of those moments. It takes grit to do what's best for the company, even when family is involved. The room chuckled politely, Forks pausing midair, as though his cruelty deserved applause. I stared at my plate, pushing roasted carrots around with my fork, fighting the heat rising in my cheeks. He wasn't just telling a story. He was broadcasting my humiliation like it was a victory banner. I waited for Adrian, my husband, his younger brother, to speak up, to say something, anything. But Adrian only swirled the wine in his glass and looked down, eyes fixed on the ruby liquid as if he could drown in it. His silence was louder than Declan's boasting. It told me where his loyalty rested. And it wasn't with me. The laughter around the table continued, punctuated by comments about discipline and tough love. My stomach turned with every word. I had given 14 years of my life to this family's company. Late nights, missed anniversaries, endless travel to salvage deals that Declan's arrogance had nearly lost. Yet here, in the so-called intimacy of family, I was nothing but a punchline to his story. Later that night, alone in the bedroom, I grabbed my phone to distract myself from the echo of their laughter. That's when I saw it. A family group chat notification I wasn't supposed to be in. I opened it without thinking, and the words hit harder than anything Declan had said at dinner. Dad finally put her in her place. One message read, "About time someone reminded charity case Soraya where she belongs." Another chimed in, "She's lucky she even has a seat at the table." A third added, followed by laughing emojis. My chest tightened. The screen blurred as I stared at the words, realizing they weren't slips of the tongue or passing cruelties. This was how they truly saw me. Not as a partner, not as a contributor, not as someone who had carried more weight than half of them combined. To them, I was baggage. I set the phone down, numbness settling into my bones. For years, I had convinced myself that hard work would eventually bridge the gap, that proving my worth would silence their doubts. But in that moment, I understood. No matter what I built, no matter how much I sacrificed, I would never be enough for them. Isolated at the dinner table, isolated in my own marriage, I realized the truth. I was not part of their family. I was merely tolerated. And that realization hurt more than any pay cut ever could. The days after that family dinner felt strangely quiet, as if humiliation had dulled my nerves into a kind of detached clarity. I stopped expecting respect, stopped hoping for recognition. Instead, I started watching, not with bitterness, but with the kind of cold patience you develop when you know a storm is coming. It didn't take long to see what Declan refused to notice. Our suppliers were no longer eager partners. They were reluctant participants. Emails went unanswered for days, invoices dragged past due, and deliveries arrived incomplete. On the surface, Tanner and Moore Industries still looked stable, but under the glossy reports, the supply chain was fraying thread by thread. Clients, too, were growing restless. I sat through meeting after meeting where longtime partners raised the same complaints: delays, broken promises, lack of communication. They didn't shout or threaten. They simply looked at me with tired eyes and asked if things would ever change. I had no authority to fix it anymore, not officially, but I still took notes. Every grievance, every delay, every lost opportunity, I recorded it all. And then there were the employees. Walking the warehouse floor used to feel like stepping into a hive of activity. Now, it was lethargic. Pallets stacked haphazardly, workers dragging their feet, managers pacing with clipped voices. Morale had collapsed under the weight of Declan's arrogance. He thought cutting costs made him strong, but all it did was bleed loyalty out of the people who kept the wheels turning. One afternoon, as I stood by the loading dock, watching another late shipment roll in, a voice pulled me from my thoughts. It was Martin Reyes, a mid-level operations manager I'd known for a decade. He glanced around before leaning close. "Soraya," he whispered, his tone heavy with risk. "If you go, a lot of us will go with you." I stared at him, unsure if he realized the gravity of what he'd just said. Martin wasn't the kind to dramatize. He was steady, loyal, the kind of man who kept his head down and did his work. For him to confess, that openly meant the foundation was cracking far deeper than anyone admitted aloud. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a leather-bound notebook and began to write. Not thoughts, not emotions, facts, supplier names, contract issues, delivery delays, employee complaints, client dissatisfaction, financial blind spots. It was a map of weaknesses, laid out in black ink under the dim light of a desk lamp. Every page felt like evidence, not of my failures, but of a system that had rotted from the inside. I wasn't plotting revenge, not yet. What I was building was clarity. Cold, precise clarity. If Declan believed his empire was unshakable, I had just begun to trace the fault lines. And once you know where the cracks are, all it takes is the right pressure to bring the whole structure down. The leather notebook on my desk was filling fast. Names, numbers, cracks in the system I'd cataloged with surgical precision. But late one evening, when I thought my only weapon was observation, a phone call shifted the ground beneath me. "Mrs. Ross," came the measured voice of Harriet Lowell, the family's longtime attorney. I believe it's time you came into the office. There are matters your husband's family has neglected to mention." Her words carried that strange weight lawyers have, the kind that makes you wonder if you're about to inherit a kingdom or a curse. I went the next morning, my heart an uneasy rhythm between hope and dread. Harriet's office smelled of old paper and stronger truths. She motioned for me to sit, her gray eyes sharp behind delicate glasses. "Your mother anticipated moments like this," she began, sliding a folder across the polished oak desk. "When she passed, her shares, 37% of the company, transferred directly to you, not your husband, not the board. You." I froze. 37%. The number lit up in my mind like a beacon, enough to shift balances, to rewrite dynamics. But the hope rising in me tangled immediately with suspicion. If this were true, why hadn't Declan, or anyone, acknowledged it? Harriet seemed to read my doubt. She tapped the folder. "There's more. The company's bylaws, drafted in your mother's era, contain a clause almost no one remembers. These shares carry veto power when formally activated under your name, not your marital connection, yours." The room felt suddenly smaller, as though the walls leaned in to hear my reaction. I opened the folder. There it was, black ink on brittle paper. Her signature at the bottom like a ghostly hand reaching forward. My throat tightened. All this time, I had been treated as decoration, tolerated at the table, and all this time, I'd been holding the silent key to their empire. But hope is never pure. It comes laced with doubt. My hands trembled as I traced the clause. Would the board accept this? Could the family contest it? Would Adrian, my husband, stand with me or against me? The thought of Declan's fury was easy to picture, the smirk wiped clean, the arrogance cracking. But I also knew men like him didn't surrender. They schemed, they struck back. I closed the folder slowly, as if sealing a promise with myself. Harriet's voice softened. "Your mother wanted you to have more than a seat at their table. She wanted you to have a voice powerful enough to change it." Hope flickered in me like a candle in a draft. Fragile, but unmistakably alive. I walked out of that office clutching the folder, unsure if I had just been handed salvation or a match to light a war. Either way, I finally held something Declan didn't, and that knowledge alone was enough to steady my breath for the first time in weeks. The garage was silent, except for the faint hum of the old freezer in the corner. I sat on a wooden crate beneath the single hanging bulb, the light weak and trembling, as if it shared my uncertainty. In my hands was a framed photo of my mother, smiling, alive, the kind of woman who commanded a room without ever raising her voice. I traced the edge of the glass with my thumb, whispering questions into the dark. Am I strong enough for this? Strong enough to fight them all? The family had made it clear, at dinner tables, in boardrooms, in whispered jokes behind my back, that I was not one of them. Declan's smirk haunted me. The way he reduced my years of work to a lesson in discipline. Adrian's silence echoed even louder. My own husband had left me standing alone. Now I had 37% of the company, shares with a hidden power no one else had noticed. It should have felt like armor. Instead, it felt like a burden too heavy for one person to carry. What if I failed? What if they destroyed me before I even made a move? In the dim light of that garage, surrounded by tools and dust, I felt as small as they always believed me to be. Tears burned hot in my eyes, sliding down before I could wipe them away. I pressed the photo against my chest. Mother! Why me? Why did you think I could do this? The silence answered back, thick and merciless. For a moment, I let despair consume me, let it wrap around my ribs like chains. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was nothing more than a charity case who'd stumbled into the family name. The vibration of my phone startled me. I pulled it from my pocket, half expecting another cruel message from the family thread. Instead, it was from Harriet. Don't forget, this is your mother's legacy. If you don't stand up, who will? The words sat heavy in my palm, heavier than the photo itself. My tears blurred the screen, but the meaning cut through sharp and clean. This wasn't just about me. It was about my mother's faith, about the company she built with her own hands, about every sacrifice she had made so her daughter could inherit more than just her name. I wiped my cheeks, breath unsteady. The despair didn't vanish. It never does. But something else began to grow beside it. A spark. Thin, fragile, but alive. Harriet's message replayed in my mind until the words carved themselves into me. If you don't stand up, who will? I looked back at my mother's photo. Her smile frozen, but her eyes alive with that quiet strength I had always admired. My grip tightened. The tears slowed. Despair gave way to resolve. Quiet but unyielding. In that dark garage, I made a promise. I would not let Declan write the ending of my story. My mother's legacy was not theirs to destroy. It was mine to protect. The ballroom lights glittered off the crystal chandeliers, casting everything in a golden haze that felt more theatrical than real. Industry leaders filled the room, seated at round tables draped in white linen, their conversations a low hum of speculation and polite laughter. At the head of the stage stood Declan, my brother-in-law, shoulders squared like a man certain of his crown. He cleared his throat, then launched into his speech with the booming authority of someone used to commanding attention. What separates Tanner and Moore Industries from the rest, he declared, is not blind innovation, but tradition. We stand on 30 years of proven success, built by family values and sustainable practices that will outlast any passing trend. Applause rippled through the hall. I sat near the back, my face composed, hands folded on the table to keep them from trembling. Inside, my pulse raced. For weeks, I had waited for this moment, wondering if I was truly prepared to shatter the illusion of his control. Declan paced across the stage, basking in his own performance. While others chase risky ventures and unstable partnerships, we rely on the strength of what has always worked. And that, he said with a satisfied smile, is why we remain the standard bearer in this industry. The timing could not have been more perfect. The moderator stepped up as the applause faded. Thank you, Mr. Moore, for those inspiring words on tradition. Now, please welcome Lydia Carrington, CEO of Carrington Global, who will be sharing her vision for the future of supply partnerships. Lydia walked onto the stage with calm assurance, her tailored navy suit sharp against the golden backdrop. I watched her every step, the anticipation tightening in my chest until it was almost unbearable. Then she spoke, clear, steady, and devastating. At Carrington Global, we believe tradition matters only when it fuels progress. That's why today, I'm proud to announce a strategic alliance with someone many of you already know and respect. The room stilled. Forks froze midair. Whispers rustled like wind in a wheat field. Lydia smiled and extended her hand toward the audience. Please welcome Soraya Ross, who will be joining Carrington Global as a partner and board advisor, bringing her 14 years of expertise and her 37% equity stake into this alliance. Every head turned. Chairs creaked. The silence cracked into astonished murmurs as I rose from my seat and walked toward the stage. My heels clicked against the polished floor, each step louder than my racing heartbeat. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. Declan's face drained of color. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The confident orator who had just proclaimed the invincibility of tradition now looked like a man caught in quicksand. I shook Lydia's hand, cameras flashing as though history itself were being recorded. The satisfaction was electric, not gloating, but steady, like finally breathing after being underwater too long. For the first time, Declan was the one on display, and for the first time, I was no longer the outsider. I was the shock he never saw coming. Dinner at the Moore estate was always theater, but that night it felt more like a trial. The long oak table gleamed under the chandelier, glasses filled with Cabernet that caught the light like rubies. I sat halfway down the table, my plate untouched, listening to the shallow hum of conversation. Declan occupied the head seat, as he always did, basking in the deference of his siblings like a king surrounded by lesser nobles. Then he turned to me, fork still in hand, his smirk practiced and sharp. Well, Soraya, he said, raising his voice just enough for everyone to hear, at least you still get half your salary. That's more than some outsiders could hope for. The words slid across the table like a blade. A few chuckles broke out, nervous and complicit. Adrian, my husband, kept his eyes fixed on his plate, silent again, as though saying nothing would shield him from choosing a side. My fingers tightened around my napkin, nails pressing crescents into the fabric. For weeks, I had absorbed his jabs, his humiliations, his smug sense of superiority. But this time, I had brought something with me. I reached into my leather satchel and pulled out a slim folder, its edges neat, its contents heavier than any weapon I had ever held. I placed it on the polished wood in front of me. The sound a sharp crack in the quiet room. Conversations died. Forks stilled. Declan, I said, my voice level, though fury coiled beneath it. I think it's time the family understood where things actually stand. His smirk widened, amused at what he assumed was another empty protest. Oh, going to file a complaint with HR? He sneered. I slid the folder toward the center. These are the legal documents confirming the transfer of 37% of the company's equity shares into my name. My mother's legacy, my right, and as of last week, they are formally registered and enforceable. The silence that followed was absolute. Chairs creaked as every head turned, eyes darting between me and the folder as though it contained live fire. Declan's expression faltered, the first visible crack in his armor. This is absurd, he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual force. I leaned forward, my tone calm, controlled, deliberate. What's absurd is believing you could cut me down without consequence. 37%. Declan. Enough to veto your decisions. Enough to shift the balance of power at this table. The weight of those words landed harder than his earlier mockery. The laughter died completely. Even Adrian finally looked up, his face pale, caught between shock and guilt. For the first time, Declan had nothing to say. The long oak table, once his stage, had become my ground. And in that silence, the power that had always pressed against me suddenly tilted in my direction. The headlines hit me like stones. Every news outlet in the region carried Declan's smug words, almost identical in tone. The equity held by Soraya Ross is purely symbolic. No real authority rests with her. Tanner and Moore remains firmly under stable leadership. I scrolled through the articles on my phone, my stomach tightening with each recycled phrase. Symbolic, decorative, meaningless. It was as if he'd carved me out of my own legacy and hung me on the wall as an ornament. My hands shook, though not with rage this time, with fear. What if people believed him? What if the documents Harriet had shown me meant nothing in the storm of his influence? The press campaign was relentless. Interviews, press releases, even staged photos of Declan shaking hands with board members who looked all too willing to fall in line. He understood the game. Perception shapes reality. And in a family empire built on reputation, my truth risked being drowned in his lies. Worse, Adrian stood at his brother's side, silent no longer. In one interview, when asked about my stake, he smiled faintly and said, "Declan has always been the true leader. Family unity is what matters most." The words burned hotter than any insult. My husband, my supposed ally, had chosen blood over marriage, leaving me standing utterly alone. At night, I lay awake replaying it all, the fear gnawing at me. Had I moved too soon? Was this a fight I could never win? The anxiety pressed on my ribs like a weight. I thought of my mother's photograph in the garage, of Harriet's reminder that this was my legacy. Yet here I was, watching Declan dismantle my credibility in public while Adrian held the hammer. Then, just as despair threatened to swallow me whole, a spark cut through the darkness. A press release appeared the following week, not from our side, but from Northwell Manufacturing, one of our largest and most loyal clients. Their CEO, a sharp-eyed woman named Elaine Harper, had gone public with a single, devastating statement. Northwell will only continue its partnership with Tanner and Moore if Ms. Soraya Ross is actively involved in operations. Her leadership is the reason we stayed through recent turbulence. Without her, there is no deal. The industry reeled. Reporters scrambled. Phones lit up. Whispers spread like fire. For a brief moment, my breath caught, hope rising sharp and bright. Declan's entire narrative cracked under the weight of one client's trust. False hope, perhaps, but enough to shift the air. Suddenly, it wasn't my word against his. It was my reputation standing in plain sight, impossible to erase. And as the tension coiled tighter, I realized something. Declan could control headlines, but he couldn't control who people trusted. And trust, once lost to him, was drifting toward me. The boardroom air was heavy, thick with the tension of unspoken agendas. Declan sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his voice cutting sharp through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his hand resting casually on the stack of papers before him. "For the good of this company, I'm calling for a formal vote to remove Soraya Ross from any role in management." His words hit like a gavel. Eyes flicked toward me, some apologetic, others coldly curious. My heart thudded against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. I knew this move was coming. Declan had backed me into corners before. This time, He thought he could erase me entirely. He continued with smug authority. Her stake is symbolic, nothing more. Her interference jeopardizes the stability we've built. It's time we put this distraction behind us. He leaned back, confident the room would follow his lead. But I had come prepared. My folder was already open, documents neatly arranged. I rose slowly, every movement deliberate, and let the silence stretch until even Declan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Symbolic? I said, my voice firm. Then explain why my 37% gives me the legal right to block any resolution you propose. Gasps rippled across the table. Declan's smirk faltered. He opened his mouth, but I pressed forward, sliding copies of the bylaws toward the independent directors. And as of this morning, both independent members of the board have pledged their votes alongside mine. That gives us majority control. Against you. The room erupted in whispers. Declan's face reddened, his composure unraveling as he realized the trap had already sprung. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was brittle, hollow. I straightened, locking my gaze on his. You cut my salary in half as if I were disposable. But here's the truth. Declan, you don't get to decide my worth. I leaned forward, every word deliberate, every syllable sharpened. You cut my pay, I cut your power to zero. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that swallows even the sound of breathing. For the first time, Declan had nothing, no words, no votes, no control. The boardroom that had always been his stage was now mine. The announcement came on a rainy Thursday morning, the kind of gray day that usually dragged spirits down. But inside Tanner and Moore's headquarters, the energy was electric. The board had voted, the papers were signed, and the reality was undeniable. I was now co-CEO, with full veto authority. Walking through the lobby felt surreal. Employees who once avoided my gaze now greeted me with warm smiles. Hands shook mine. Voices whispered words like "finally" and "about time." Suppliers sent messages of support, congratulating me, some even admitting they had stayed only because they trusted me. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. I was recognized, respected, and, most of all, free. Declan kept his distance. I caught sight of him once in the hallway, shoulders slumped, his usual arrogance replaced with something close to defeat. He no longer held the stage. The balance had shifted. And though I didn't gloat, the vindication burned bright inside me. That afternoon, I stepped into my new office. The nameplate on the door gleamed. Soraya Ross, co-CEO. My breath caught. For years, I had been written off as an outsider, treated like a burden. Now my name stood in brass letters. Undeniable. I reached into my bag and pulled out a framed photograph of my mother. Her smile forever steady, her eyes filled with quiet strength. Placing it beside the nameplate on my desk, I whispered, I kept your legacy, Mom. I didn't let them erase you, or me. The weight I had carried for years seemed to lift in that moment. Not only had I survived Declan's cruelty, but I had turned it into the very fuel that secured my place. He had tried to cut me down, and instead, I had built something stronger, something lasting. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about redefining family. Blood may have opened the door for Declan, but justice and competence kept it open for me. I proved that loyalty, hard work, and courage mean more than a last name ever could. So here's my message to you. Never let anyone convince you that you don't belong. Strength is not inherited, it's earned. If you've ever fought to prove your worth, you know exactly how it feels to rise. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story touched you, hit like, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more stories that remind us, justice always finds its voice.